One of the first things I think I'd like to say is we usually have panels after presentations, but I think that was a really great idea to actually have the panel first. I think it's a kind of a nearly get your eye in, so I think as an approach, I found it very refreshing. Okay, so thanks a million for turning up this morning. And I suppose we want to talk about evidence-based. So I'm doing it through the lens of this addressing students and motivation, but I suppose the takeaway I'm looking to leave you with is more around evidence than this particular project. This has kind of been used as the tool to talk about how we might approach a project like that. So maybe just to start off, I know I did an introduction the last day, but just to give you a little bit of information, Learnovate, we're a not-for-profit, as I've mentioned earlier, industry-led centre of excellence for research and innovation. And I think that research and innovation is important because a lot to what Alison was talking about earlier, they are siblings, but they actually do have their own sort of aspects to them, and getting that balance together is really important. We're based in Trinity College Dublin. Trinity will be the #1 university in Ireland, established in 1592. Fantastic campus here in the centre of Dublin. But on top of that, it's not just kind of all heritage and history. And literally in the last you can see that's dated November 19th. Trinity have just basically announced a 1.1 billion plan to develop actually our neck of campus, which is great, into an innovation district. And I think to the students specifically on this call today, this is the focus and importance that's being put on innovation, and EdTech would certainly be a component of that in Trinity's plans moving forward. So we want to talk about evidence today, and understand where evidence sits and what role it plays. And I think the first thing, and I'd really hope you take this away nearly as the #1 takeaway, is that this evidence is gathered in two fashions, and it kind of relates to that idea of innovation and research as well, as we mentioned. The first thing we look for evidence for is there a customer with a problem? Yeah. So that's that innovation research evidence. We want to understand who this customer is. And again, this is all covered on that day one presentation, how we have a structured approach to try and gather evidence around that aspect. And when we have that, then we can move on to see, does our solution address that problem? And that's probably going to involve an awful lot more of that sort of traditional evidence gathering. And that'll be an awful lot more of the angle that we'll cover today, is that does our solution address the problem, and what evidence we can gather to support that idea. So, when we're looking to do research, we're looking to provide a solution. But again, just to recap on last week, we're saying we want to focus in on the problem first. And to do that, we want to profile, who is this person? Who is it that we think? What's a low-hanging fruit typical example of this customer segment we're talking about? And we get quite specific around that. And then we talk about what jobs are they trying to get done that we feel we can help. And we talked about pivots and technology changing so rapidly. The whole jobs they're trying to get done don't change. So again, this idea that I used this in the previous presentation, people don't want 1/4-inch drill bits, they want 1/4-inch holes. You can't buy a hole, so you have to use the tool of a drill bit to create that hole. Now, people have wanted holes all their lives, for various things, to hang up pictures, hang up coats, whatever, hang up deer skins going back probably thousands of years. So human needs tend to be an awful lot more stable than technology. So the technology might change, but the human need doesn't tend to change so quickly. So we try and get into a problem at that level. And if we understand that there's a job that people are struggling to get done at the moment, or a problem they need solved, we stand a much better chance of solving that. And if we can validate our assumptions, if we find that painful problem that people have, instead of pushing a product on them, we'll create pull. They'll be waiting for us to bring this to them because we're addressing a painful problem for our customer segment. That's a quick review of the first side of that evidence-based. And as I say, the other talk that I've given is focuses in on that if you are interested. So let's move to this other side. Does our solution address the problem? And in developing out that solution, what evidence can we gather? And what we're going to do is look at basically an example from Learnovate, which is actually also my PhD work. So what's the problem? And again, you'll see this little yellow thing popping up throughout the presentation, talking to evidence and where can we get evidence. And the problem we were looking at is this idea, you can read that there yourself, but the whole idea of undergraduate academic motivation lacking. Yeah, we see this a lot. You can see that 29% of studies in Ireland, students, I should say, you know, have this motivational aspect, and we know that dropout is a huge problem. And dropout, when it ultimately comes to that, has a three-way impact. Obviously, for the student themselves, you know, there's obviously a sense of not feeling good about themselves, feeling of failure. For the college, they're left with that hole usually from first year through to fourth year, if it's a 4-year course. And then obviously to the wider economy, because we're not getting the talent pool through. So in terms of looking for a problem, you know, quite a painful problem for quite a few stakeholders. But if we focus in on one of those stakeholders, we said our plan was to investigate the potential to alleviate that lack of motivation for academic studies with a focus on first-year students. And if I can just say that while we say there's a load of stakeholders, if I go back to that earlier piece, you can see what we're doing here, right? We've got a specific problem here, which is a lack of motivation, and we have a specific customer segment. We're talking about first-year students, undergrad, right? So we're focusing ourselves to make ourselves stick to studying something that we believe we might be able to work with. Standard enough approach we would take with this is we'll probably turn to the literature review. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that not necessarily only academic literature. And Alison referred to this as well. You know, this is real world as well as academic world. So we go and talk to the institutions or any other sources that we feel we might be able to shine a light on this problem with. Design something quick. Just test if something's going to work. Yeah. And again, that's that innovation, quick idea of seeing if it's working. If we're successful, we could develop a model and we could investigate how we might approach this problem. And ultimately, moving on from that model, a framework that could support an intervention process through technology, of course, which I have in my heading because we are a technology center, and deploy that framework and once again, analyze the outcomes. So that's the plan. But again, I would point out investigation of the potential. If we say we're going to develop, well, then we're saying there's no need for research because we've made up our minds anyway, right? So this is an investigation, it's research, and we have to be open to understanding that we may not find what we want through that research. In terms of looking at that literature review and based on my own experience, and I would have done a lot of work in the area of motivation, and a lot of work in the area specifically of self-determination theory of motivation from Decky and Ryan. And again, we're starting to see it's all moving a little bit away from the innovation side and moving a little bit into the academic side. So self-determination theory talks about these three basic psychological needs. And don't forget, we've identified motivation as an issue, and we're looking now to see what model. And when we think of self-determination theory, whether you know it or whether you're familiar with it or not, most people these days are familiar with these two components of it: extrinsic motivation and intrinsic. Extrinsic being that I'm motivated to do it for some reward, which is not necessarily cash. It could be praise, it could be a mark. And intrinsic, where I'm doing it for my own interest. And often intrinsic is seen as the gold standard, although that on a different day, I'd have a chat about that. But so an awful lot of the research in this area, when we start to looks at these, but the spectrum of self-determination theory has a third aspect to it, which is amotivation. And amotivation basically is Deck and Ryan talk about it as a lack of motivation. It's sort of it's nearly beyond an apathy, but it's associated with sort of the negative aspects of motivation. Um, and again, we look here and say the research tells us there's a great need to look at academic amotivation. And when we expand ourselves to academic amotivation, we are sort of seeing different views that actually our motivation turns out to be a set of negative inner held beliefs around why I have no motivation. So in looking to the literature review, we're starting to see stuff emerge and we're saying, hang on, you start with the problem. So instead of focusing on the motivation aspects, we said, let's start with the problem, which is amotivation, yeah, or academic amotivation to be more specific. So we dig into amotivation and look at the intervention studies, and there's not much in the literature. Now that, again, from a sort of academic perspective, can be good and bad, because as you look to sort of build and step on the shoulders of giants, there isn't much there. But there was some work there in TEFL and in physical education. In expanding that search to motivation and performance in education, I saw a meta-analysis of 92 interventions with a very large amount of participants, which did indeed show effect. But actually, the word amotivation doesn't feature once in a meta-analysis of 92 interventions, which I found interesting in and of itself. There was some work around teaching interventions, and this was basically about training teachers about how to address amotivation when they come across it in the class. Again, evidence. So I'm just going there to see what could I find, what could I build on, So, and the reason I'm doing that is we get back to this idea of confidence. If there's stuff in here I can work with, well, then that gives me a steer on how I might address my specific problem. So the evidence may not necessarily always be linked to what you're doing, but again, that idea of confidence, it will give you confidence to move down that road. When I moved out to look at academic amotivation, it actually emerges as this multi-dimension construct. I talked about the negative beliefs, but those negative beliefs in relation to motivation actually break down into 4 subsets. Ability, I don't believe I have the ability. Effort, even with great effort, I don't think I could achieve the result. Value, which is I don't value this course or module at all. And then the task characteristics. I find these tasks boring. And the research that had been done by Legault et al. Kind of said these are also linked to some associated behaviors: performance, self-esteem, dropout, and problem behaviors in class. And that the type of amotivation linked directly to an outcome, or significantly, shall we say, to an outcome. So, and they'd also developed what they called an academic amotivation index, which meant I had a tool that I could use in an experiment. So this index would measure your amotivation levels and give a subscale for each of these. Now, again, in terms of evidence, which is the focus of today's, these, always go see if there's a tool, because the tool, again, improves your confidence, because this tool has been used many times in many different research situations. So you can have faith in what it's going to say to you. So if you can, it's always worthwhile digging around. And I went as far as to see what support there was for this tool as a credible measure of our motivation. And again, in research, it came up as being one of the believable, credible tools involved. So think about that as well when you're looking for evidence. So there's more work went on, but I don't want to sort of keep you here all day. But so there's just a synopsis of the sort of work that was going on. And at this point, we understood the problem space, and we had a little notion about, at least from a theoretical point of view, how we might be able to influence behavior. But I think this is also important. We now had no preconceived idea as to how we would approach it. So we went into the problem space, we got deep into there, we got notions around from a psychological perspective where it could be improved, but how the rubber would hit the road, we didn't have any preconceived idea. Would it be lecturer led? Would it be run through the virtual learning environment? This is the time we started to think about it. And during conversations, And just from that perspective, I think that's something you can bring with you as well on your research journey. You know, that whole idea that if you only have a hammer, the nail is always, or the solution is always a nail. And it's that idea that if we've started off understanding that it's going to be an app or whatever it is, it limits our thinking. So leave yourself open to thinking about how you might attack the problem until you really, really understand it. So in looking to a solution and in conversations with a few colleagues of mine, the concept of behavioral economics came up. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the whole idea of behavioral economics or not, but it's this idea of influencing our behavior without directly saying, do this. And I think sunscreen is a great example of it, because, you know, it's not too many years ago when probably the highest factor you'd see on a beach would be, you know, 2. And certain people would be using oil, 0 oil, etc. Over the years, we've seen ourselves really change, and most people will be lathering up at something north of 50 these days. But there was no government diktat that came out and said it. It was just through changes in our environment, and it actually would have been subtly through changes like, you know, even celebrities, etc., cutting back on sort of how very tan they look. So that's a change that was brought about, understanding that people have emotions, norms, and motivations, etc. But we still want to try and influence their decision making for their better. And that's basically what behavioral economics is about. It's understanding that humans can make irrational decisions. So we need to sort of help them. And again, we'd see an awful lot of behavioral economics brought through in various different areas like this, like stop smoking, healthy eating, etc. They tend to manifest as nudges, and just briefly to talk through nudges, you know, behavioral economics moves on into liberal paternalism. So you motivate through a sense of choice, i.e., I'm not telling you, but maybe you might want to make the right choice. Choice architecture, it's designed to guide people to the right choice, which then in turn gives you that nudge. So it's an intervention that preserves the idea that you're making the choice, but actually can hopefully strongly influence that decision. And of course, probably most famously, and maybe not most positively, but the Trump election and Brexit would be 2 areas that it's believed nudges, behavioral economics, were used very strongly to change the direction of the normal thinking of entire populations. But in moving on to look at nudges in education, you know, found evidence that actually they're in use and have been in use probably since about 2010. Damgaard and Nielsen had this report, and then we got some great insights onto the different ways that nudges are used in education and how they help bring people along. So evidence again that, you know, you're using something that's not completely alien to the area. Looking at some of the studies, more evidence, they were used to create engagement. They were linked to performance. Actually, I'm just going to go back to that slide if I can. Just we talk about evidence. There are a few issues with that one on auto emails. In reading it, that actually balked with me in terms of evidence. I won't get in, but we do talk about that. And as you become sort of more familiar with this sort of space, you get better at sort of saying, well, hang on, that's a problem there for the evidence in there. Prompts, text messaging, all looking for evidence. So we now had a problem, and we now had a strategy to approach the solution. So we designed it. How are we going to fill the gap? We said we're going to start with the problem. We're going to try and make it data driven. We're going to try and make it personal, because motivation is personal. We're going to apply design rigor and evidence-based again. If you're familiar with the ARCS instructional design method, it's around attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. And they basically do tend to link very closely to those behaviors and to the levels of amotivation we talked about earlier. So as we can target the level of amotivation, taking into account which of those 4 areas are amotivated at the time, and can we link it to performance? So in terms of going back to our objectives, we'd gone through our literature review, and now we were about to design a quick intervention to test any initial hypothesis. This is how it was going to work. Ultimately, we hope to be able to see breadcrumbs of student activity, but at this moment in time, we were going to use a self-report form. From there, we're going to profile their academic motivation. For the purposes of speed and time, we said we'll just focus in on value and ability because they're actually very different. There can be some crossover in these other ones. So we took value and ability. And from there, we hoped to develop out an intervention model that would draw a series of nudge bank, basically, and with tutor input to help us personalize that nudge to the module in hand, feedback the targeted nudges. This is what that first experiment looked like. We got them to do those self-reports, as I say, because we haven't got technology built yet. We got them to fill out that academic motivation. So this one was around the amount of behavior that we could witness, and this one was about how they were feeling from an motivation perspective. The groups were randomly assigned to ability nudges and to value nudges. At the end of the experiment, they basically completed those same two questionnaires again. We did have opportunity to look at their Moodle activity, but didn't get a chance to in that one. And then basically we analyzed it. And before we move on, I suppose it's important to say this is about amotivation. So if you're not amotivated, it's probably unlikely that this intervention is going to have much effect. It's targeted at helping those who are amotivated. So that first test, 61 students across 3 different courses. Of the 61, 34 only, real problem. Another one I'll tell you. I'm sure everybody here who works in research will know that getting them to do the second survey is never quite as easy. So 34 finished it up. And they were randomly assigned, as I mentioned. And the way that randomization was done was actually sorted them by their phone number and then did 555. So unless they had some plan for their phone numbers, we could be sure enough that it was randomized. Instruments, I mentioned earlier this idea of, you know, if you're going to create a survey, just look and see, is there a validated, because again, it helps support your evidence. So I used, as I mentioned, this academic motivation inventory. I basically, I had to flip some of the questions because it's a very negative phrased tool. And the college that was participating asked, could I flip half of them? I consulted with some psychologists in Trinity who felt that's fair enough. Actually, ironically, this is just a little aside, and we talk about evidence. We see there's a good correlation between whether they asked the flipped one negatively marked or not, except out here. So in the non-flipped version, asking a negative question, people were ready enough to sort of say it does not correspond at all. Yeah. But in the flipped one, you can imagine that meant they were saying corresponds exactly, even though it was a positive one. So people were reluctant to say they were brilliant. And there's actually probably a small paper even in that. So we can see it varied here and then got back on track here. That might have been a step too far for this presentation. Apologies. Sorry. So back to the story. I also wanted to use this behavior tool that Legault had developed. And, you know, another little bit of advice to researchers, just reach out to them. You know, you might think they're sort of rock stars or something like that because they're published psychologists, etc. I reached out and said, listen, I'm doing this interesting work. And there you can say, Lisa, and I couldn't find it. So I got in touch to see, could she send me a copy of it? But she gave me some tips that helped me recreate it. So reach out to people if you found stuff in the literature and see if they can help you. Needed to employ some technology, Qualtrics, votive Qualtrics, basically, obviously, to develop out the survey, the text messages, drew up a randomization time list through Excel, then sent it out through Vodafone, and SPSS, if you're familiar with it, to analyze the data. I'll just leave that for a second. That's the kind of messages the guys were getting, be they value or ability. So basically, as I say, just to try and support them in their thinking around why the course is valuable, and then trying to support them through these nudges about improving their ability. All the data in, all coded up, looking for the evidence. Interestingly, this is the sort of data back, and I think it's interesting that the gray indicates the motivated students. And I think there's another hypothesis comes to view here just from this very simple graphic, which is look at the amount of business that are amotivated versus journalism and data science. And I hypothesize, and I haven't put any evidence or research into this, that if we take a business degree, you're basically training to go out into the world to possibly be a financial person, a salesperson, a management person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With journalism and data science, I see there being slightly more vocational. You know what you're going to be when you come out the other end. You're going to be a journalist or a data science. And I hypothesize that possibly that's why there's less motivation coming through on those courses. Quick scatter plot, again, looking for evidence. Now, to talk through this very briefly, this scatter plot is each individual case. The y-axis is showing their measurement of motivation before, and the x-axis is showing their motivation afterwards. So the blue line would, of course, represent that one-to-one, pretty much didn't change. Anything moving in this direction, as indicated by the orange, would mean it was positive, and anything moving this way would be negative. And we can see it sticks reasonably to the line with some movement. But if we understand first that this is the break-off line for what we consider amotivated. So none of the people down in this half of the chart were amotivated to start with. So if we rule them out and look at the people who were amotivated to start, we actually get a very different picture. And this is just a little thing about in terms of looking for evidence. So what we can see here is that these were all amotivated to start with, and only 2 of them moved in a negative trajectory. And either be it small or be it large, everyone else moved in a positive directory and 1 stayed still. Analyzing the data to look for statistics and get some evidence. We can see here that the not amotivated, looking at the means, basically changed from 29 to 31. So not much of a movement. And don't forget, we're looking to reduce our motivation. So if anything, it's slightly increased. Oh, sorry. On the other hand, if we look at the amotivated students in pre and post, we can see there's a difference just visually straight away. But again, as you look for evidence, you know, this is a Wilcoxon rank test because this data was not parametric. And that we showed significance. And of course, we always talk about this idea of showing significance, which gives us help with that confidence. So in this case, the difference between pre and post was considered significant, which means all other things being concerned, there's a high probability that the intervention is what made the difference. Evidence, yeah. If I break that out into the 4 subcategories, and I'll move through this quite quickly, again, even visually, we can see that value and ability have moved more than effort and task, yeah. And that's interesting to us because they were the 2 we targeted, even be it randomly. Both of the targeted interventions were on value and ability. And again, near significant with value and significant change with ability. I mentioned the behavior, and we had no idea that the behavior would pay any dividends, and we didn't even analyze it as such to see if it did, but we just wanted to test the tool to see when we do later tests, can we gather the evidence around that self-report of their behaviors? For instance, how often are you late for class? You know, I intend to drop out of school. So we were just seeing that we can get that behavior so as we can match it with the motivation, breaking into those 4 categories. So the roadmap, as I say, ultimately we're using self-report at the moment, but we already have plans on how we can track those behaviors we talked about through breadcrumbs, through the student's life on campus, late delivery of papers, attendance in class, activity on VLEs, various different aspects, potentially even a quiz. And that will in turn give us this motivation profile, which will apply the nudge strategy then. And one of the things that we changed as we went in this is the understanding that you need tutor lecture input. 1, to make them feel involved in this, that it's not some black box sending out nudges to their students, but 2, as I said, to focus it on their particular module, which in turn gives us the nudge bank, and the nudges are delivered, ultimately hoping to improve their motivation status and hopefully improve their performance. So where am I now? Well, the second experiment launched on the 12th of March, so I think you can probably guess how that went. We literally had students running to the four corners of the world during that period of time, so it wasn't that great. And the third experiment launches now on the 10th of December, which is next week. And basically, from there on, it'll look to develop out the tools that might support it. We talk about evidence again today, and sort of, if you want to show your evidence, you've always got to have your list of references at the end. So these are the references for the material we've looked at today. And I hope that was of some use to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And well, I think it's one of my favorite sessions so far, because what I'm missing normally during the conferences are these concrete pieces of information and concrete results that we get from our speakers, right? So instead of talking about how the obvious things that everybody knows, giving these exact things that we don't have access to on a daily basis. So thank you for that, and the references definitely will be useful, and I'm happy that we are recording it. But there was a question if the presentation will be shared.
Yes, it will be.
How about the nudge bank? Does it have some general elements that we could carry over? That's from Andreas.
That we could carry over. Sorry, I might just ask for a bit of clarification on that.
Andreas, do you mind?
Sure. So thank you, Peter. It was really exciting to see what you're studying there. And motivation is, you put that now in the context of the particular students. And what I'd be interested in is if there's anything in it that we can carry over into different contexts, which are maybe not in college, in different university studies, in corporate life, etc.
Yes. Again, I think, Andres, and thank you for that. I think what we look to do is we started with. I go back to the innovation stuff again. We started with the low-hanging fruit. This is a really painful problem, and even anecdotally, we could see that through our own colleges. So we started here, and it's iterative design. So we're not wed to anything at the moment. It would be brilliant, of course, if I could pour in first year undergrad nudges into that bank, and have them applied. But I actually believe that as I visualize it, there are certain general ones that we could look at, but there are also those specific ones. And as I said, getting tutor lecturer buy-in is really important too. As I say, that if they push back on it, we're all in trouble, and we don't want that big brother thing. I visualize a scenario where, and this is how I'm doing this experiment, is I've created nearly a fill in the blanks type toolkit. Okay. So I go to Andres and I say, okay, your module this year, just try fill in the blanks on this, So one of the important things about sort of ability would be understanding how you're going to complete that exam. I can see I've just about disappeared, by the way, now. But this whole idea of understanding the exam. So there could be at the end summative aspect of this course, you will be required to, and ask you to use your knowledge to focus that in, because one thing is that makes those nudges then very self-referential for the student at a really tight level, at this module level, So I think it'll always require an aspect, but in my mind, it works on the basis that Andres has decided to use the nudge bank, and basically at the start of the semester can fill out, or maybe if it hasn't from previous year, they're the same, but can fill out those nudges and they're yours. So when the behavior in relation to your particular module hits any sort of level, the nudges are triggered. Yeah. To focus in on the angle of it. So there's that little piece of input, which I think is positive because it gets buy-in. And so to answer your question, of course, that could be switched around to work at different levels. You'd have to also obviously work out, because in a formal education system, we can see those breadcrumbs through VLEs, we can see them through behavior in classrooms, and in a learning and development context, that might be slightly different. I think from a school's perspective, I think it could very easily move across to that space. but let's see if this one works first.
Thank you, Peter. Before you disappear completely, a few more questions.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting one from Raki. We'll wait until you're back to ask it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No
So very interesting question from Raki. This is such an interesting research, I agree. Thanks so much for sharing. When students' activities are being monitored, Moodle activity, late submission, etc., as a prompt for the nudge, is students' data privacy being taken into account? Will students get a feeling of being watched?
So there's no data here that isn't on those systems. Yeah. So in terms of a college's GDPR would say that there is nothing different happening here other than, yes, a potential use of that. But the use here is very much for support. It's for student support. So in terms of this being a research project, and again, I'll go back to the topic of evidence, you know, obviously ethics are required to undertake study, which is a really important part of it. And ethics were sought and received both from Trinity College and from the college that was participating in the trial. So you need to get that and understand that basically, you know, in doing this research, which is not innovation research, it's much more that focused research. You know, I have a sort of an information sheet that's gone out to every participant in which it's all explained very clearly what I'm doing to them. And they've agreed to sign up for this. So I do believe, yes, there would be some buy-in required for students to say we operate the, you know, nudge bank system to support students. Are you okay with that? So I think there probably would need to be some level of buy-in required at a productized level. Yes.
Now, actually, with Raki, we had this conversation a few days ago, and I found it really, really interesting point of view. So, do we as students have a chance to say no if we don't want to be tracked and analyzed and so on? But that's probably a question for a much bigger conversation.
Yeah, let me actually, if you remember, I mentioned about the evidence in one of those papers, right? Let me just dive into that a teeny bit. So what actually happened there is they asked people to sign up for this study aid prompt, yeah, and they ran it. And what they measured the performance against was those who didn't sign up. Now that, to me, is a fundamental design issue, because the profile of who signs up versus those who don't sign up is probably an indicator. You could have stopped right there and made your prediction on what was going to happen in the performance level. Yeah. I think they say, you know, your state of fitness is the biggest indicator of whether you'll engage in exercise, you know. So the people who sign up are most likely those who didn't need it in the first place. And the people who didn't sign up were probably those who did. So that's a flaw. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there's no change. We'll be analyzed anyway at all stages. Okay, so another question from Caroline. Is there any specific part of this that connects directly to how the students are feeling emotionally, and how does this project help with that? You spoke about self-esteem, for example, or it's primarily academic at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, per se, we got to be obviously conscious of what we can and can't do within the scope of this project. So this is a light touch, you know, as nudges tend to be. Yes, you could use this, and we're focused in, as we mentioned, on value and ability, self-esteem, etc. You know, we would leave that to, and most colleges at this stage have a lot of systems in place to identify at-risk students. So we leave that basically to more qualified, more kind of serious interventions. This is, as we mentioned, a nudge to just kind of support them a bit and see if we can nudge them along to a better behavior, as the name suggests.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Samuel. Hello, Peter. You did indicate the importance of the tutor-teacher element in this whole motivation challenge for students. Did the study extend to get some input from teachers, tutors, especially given that teachers, tutors are in a position have huge numbers of students going through their class every day?
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of the involvement, I suppose the most direct answer is not to any great extent. We have worked with the participants. So I think we've worked with about 8 lecturers across that college, and we've involved them in it and got their opinions in terms of what would they like to see in and out of it. Per se, we got buy-in for the process. And again, I get back to, I suppose, this concept of it being a light touch nudge. It doesn't proclaim to be anything else. So it's not a silver bullet. It's just adding to that arsenal, and it's seen as a light touch scenario that can just support. So ultimately, probably some form of plug into a VLE that basically just supports. But as we see, you know, it was showing some promising results there earlier on, evidence. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one thing that probably we should all remember when it comes to analyzing research results is that research is normally on very specific topics. So the questions here asking about the well-being or how the tutors are, what the positions of them are in the process. So all these questions we have to consider, and they're good ideas to move forward. But we always have to remember that all the research papers are very specific and are talking about very specific topics. Is that how we should look at it?
Yes, yeah, I do see that. You know, again, this is what I talk about, a silver bullet. You know, just about any project you look at will not be the silver bullet. You're just looking to see what can you add to the equation, what can you add to the story. And as a piece of research, I go all the way back to the start of this presentation and say it's investigating the potential. And while we've had some initial early results, this test that's starting next Thursday may not show those results, and then we'll have our question as to why didn't they. You know, will COVID have caused an effect here? You know, so and while I was kind of thinking we would wrap up on this experiment, there may well be another experiment, I think, early in the next year to sort of see, even between this one and that one, are students leveling out in terms of their amotivation in relation to as time progresses. But again, yes, Milena, this is focused research on an aspect. It doesn't set out to be the answer to motivation. Yeah.
So the next question would be, if we want to get a broader picture, where should we go? Where should we look for more information?
Well, it's all out there. No, I mean, I suppose to the other side of this, maybe it's worth mentioning an answer to that question. The next project I'm actually kicking off in terms of ourselves would be one of those kind of knowledge gathering ones. So we're not necessarily, again, going out with any notion of a solution, but we're going out to try and understand. There's been a massive knee-jerk reaction with the learning and development community and remote workers in getting online, working from home, all that kind of stuff. What we want to go out is understand what issues are arising, okay, what problems are arising, and what's being trialed and what's working and what's not working. From there, we'd hope to probably get about 4 projects. You know, so this is where we would go first, to kind of scatter out and see where the issues are, and then we'd see where technology might be able to support in an aspect like this one. Yeah.
Great. And the last question from Artemis today. Artemis is wondering if the results of the post survey in your case help to predict the students' data. It is always a question how much we can trust the research results.
Watch this space. I mean, that if I go back to my plan, right, we said get out quick, get out sharp, and see, can you move the needle for a start, okay? But it's actually always our intention to see, can we link it to performance? So part of that data that we were saying at the front and back that currently is being gathered as self-report, yeah? And we had got GPA in there as one of the self-reports to try and look at that. But that initial test wasn't over a long enough period. This one, Artemis, will, and it's actually not being timed by mistake. The thing is, you're trying to catch first years. And by the way, again, just from a design perspective, I wanted to catch first years, and I thought there's no point in going into first years in the first week they're in there, because they don't know what they don't know at that stage. Yeah. So that's why we're leaving it till this time of year. They got some understanding of what first year college looks like now. They're also coming up to their Christmas assessment. So they will run their Christmas assessment before I start sending nudges on. They also then have another assessment in mid-February, And it's at that time that we'll be looking to do the rematch. And that's when we'll be looking to see, is there any correlation on out to performance? Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter.
No
That would be it for today. And thank you for the insights. Remember, please, that all the videos from today's both panel session and now the presentation of Peter and the Q&A, we'll post it on the YouTube channel and in the LinkedIn group. So if you have any more questions or any thoughts that you would like to share with the rest of the network, please feel free to go on to the LinkedIn group and share it with us, because I'm sure that these kind of conversations, I mean, the more of these conversations we have and the more insights we share one with the other, the more we can move forward with the research, with EdTech innovation, with innovative education in general. So thank you very much for the session number 1 today. And in the afternoon, we will see Alison and Anissa again. And Alison will be talking about important research outputs in the field of educational technology. So we'll zoom out a little bit and look at the research results in general. And later, Anissa will be talking about the 6 superpowers of EdTech enterprises. So I'm sure you will find a lot of interesting insights over there as well. Thank you, Anissa. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Peter. And I hope to see you this afternoon.